You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Mish Shedlock, editor of Mish's Global Economic Trend Analysis. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Pleasure to be on. I've been traveling. I've been on the road, been Zion National Park, Bryce, and North Carolina recently, so I've been traveling a lot. It's good to be back home.
The U.S. dollar continues to surge. What's the news powering it?
Well, today it collapsed 2% following Mario Draghi's announcement, ECB. Apparently, what would seem to me to have been a pretty dovish announcement was interpreted by the auction, by the markets, as almost being hawkish, which is kind of amazing given the things that the ECB said that it would do today. First off, it lowered its interest rates to a record low, negative 0.3%. The ECB said that it would continue its 60 billion euros a month bond buying program until March 2017 or beyond. The ECB pledged to buy more assets with the proceeds of its bond purchases, and it said that it would buy municipal bonds in addition to standard government debt, and the market interpreted all of that as not enough. Pretty amazing.
Right, and buying municipal bonds, I hope they're not buying Chicago.
Well, I believe they would be restricted to places in Europe, probably looking at, Italy, Spain. I don't know what they have their eyes on. They didn't particularly say on that. But as always, the markets are hooked here on more and more and more and more easing. And a funny statement here comes from Andrew Balls. He's the chief officer for fixed income at PIMCO. He said the ECB delivered at the very low end of expectations. There wasn't much to get excited about. The markets were anticipating an increase in the monthly purchase size. So I guess deeper and deeper into negative interest rate territory, and stretching the bond buying program all the way out to March of 2017 at a minimum. It was nothing to get excited about, Jim. Nothing at all, and clearly not enough.
Well, how do negative interest rates work, and how do they help?
Well, they don't help at all. How do they work? I don't think they do work at all. So, but the ECB's idea is that these negative rates are going to spur, lending. It really hasn't happened, and I don't think it will. Instead, it's going to punish savers who have their money, in the banks collecting zeros. So we're not talking about negative deposit rates just yet, although they have happened in some places in Europe. So the idea is that these lower rates are going to spur people to spend. In theory, in practice, it actually has not happened that way. And I don't believe it will. All it's going to do is just further punish savers. And I would like to point out that someone has to hold every dollar 100% of the time, and someone has to hold every euro 100% of the time. So if they think that this is going to cause money to be spent, let's say you go out and buy a TV. Well, what does the store do with the money then? Someone has to hold every one of these dollars every second of the time. So the idea that someone's, that all this money is going to be like spent and disappear, just mathematically cannot work that way.
And what happens when you run out of savings to spend?
What happens with? Well, they just print more. But here we've had QE for over 20 years in Japan. We have had QE in the U.S. We've had QE in the Eurozone, and it hasn't worked. And these guys' plan apparently is, if it doesn't work, we need to do more of it. It's the only thing they know. In the U.S., Bernanke actually said, in theory, QE doesn't work. In practice, it does. Well, all it's done, if you call it work, is it's created asset bubbles in the U.S., in Europe.
Right, and we know, of course, whenever you have a bubble, it's going to burst at some point. And the more that we have semi or quasi-government intervention, we know that eventually it's going to blow up.
That's exactly correct. That's so we can look. It's like the guy falling out of the window of a 20-story building and saying, at the 10th story everything's still okay. Well, at some point he's going to hit the ground, at which point things will no longer be okay. And so for Bernanke, and Yellen said the same thing just a couple of days ago, said something to the effect, well, we need to hike interest rates. We can't delay these things too long, because we need to be at risk of blowing another bubble in financial assets. Well, excuse me, Janet, but you've already blown another bubble in assets. All you can do by hiking is pop the bubble, which is what I think is going to happen.
And once that pop happens, what's the fallout?
I don't know. We can have another crash like 2007, or we can just do a slow, painful, drag out decline in assets for, say, the next 7 years or 5 years or 10 years. A decade wouldn't surprise me. If you look at the Nikkei, it had several 50 or 100% rallies along the way over the course of 2 decades, but all the while it fell from about 40 or 50,000 all the way down to 7,500 before it started going back up again. So it wouldn't surprise me at all. I don't think the U.S. would drag out as long as Japan did. We're talking decades here. But certainly we could go on to a prolonged period of slow decline in the stock market, and I think that would absolutely crucify pension funds who are expecting 8%, every year. What if they get negative 2%, which doesn't sound so bad, but what if they get negative 2% for 8 straight years? It's going to be very, very painful, and I'm leaning towards a scenario like that.
Crude oil, any hope for that coming back soon now?
I don't know about soon. It's an asset that's certainly out of favor, as is gold. That doesn't mean it's bottomed yet. It actually kind of doesn't look like it. But how low it goes, I don't know. And some of that's going to be a function of the slowing global economy, and some of it's going to be maybe related to a bust of U.S. and Canadian oil producers right here. So we'll see. I favor buying assets that are really beat up. I'm just not certain that oil's bottomed yet.
What about our real estate markets in Canada and the U.S.? Are they in danger of collapsing again?
Well, they're always in danger of collapsing, and the surprising thing here is how resilient Canada has been. But some of that has been buyers from China coming in and buying up everything, say, in Vancouver at increasingly absurd prices. One would have thought that this bubble would have popped long ago. The Chinese buyers hit the west coast of the U.S. too in the last couple of years, buying up stuff along the California coast. So when these bubbles end, I don't know. Australia's got a bubble. The UK has a bubble. The bubble in the U.S. actually is well under the size of the bubbles elsewhere, say in Canada, Australia, China, the UK.
We'll have more with Mish Shedlock right after the break.
See singing impressionist Andre Philippe Gagnon.
And I think to myself,
In Oliver, December 29th. In Kelowna, December 30th. Buy online and save at ontourtickets.com. Unbelievable harmonies, spectacular performance, the ultimate tribute to the Everly Brothers and Simon and Garfunkel. Bird Dog and the Vintage Electric Band, Saturday, January 9th at the Alex Goulden Hall. Buy online and save at ontourtickets.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Mike Mish, Shedlock. Mish, is there any area right now that you think is a bright light, or is this a case of grab your cash and head for cover for a while?
Well, I would have said this: grab your cash and head for cover 2 years ago, and I would have been wrong. But I certainly don't see any need to change that stance right here. It appears to me the whole entire global economy is sinking. Earnings estimates have not lived up to the hype, which actually makes the stock market even more overvalued. 10-year smooth PEs are at an absurd level here. Forward PEs, I don't think, are going to live up to their expectations on the earnings front. So, where to from here? The Atlanta Fed is estimating, and I follow their model closely, GDP for fourth quarter is going to be about 1.4%. So here we are. The whole year, if that comes in, is going to average right around 2%, okay? And we've been averaging 2% pretty much for the whole recovery. The recovery is going on 7 years, so 8 years. So here we are with the weakest recovery on record, averaging about 2% growth, and the 7 years is a long time, and here we are, and the Fed's about ready to hike when we've got terrorism threats in Europe, now in the U.S. President Obama came out today and said that this thing might have been terrorism related, and indeed this latest attack in California. The person involved went to Pakistan, came back radicalized, and shot a bunch of people. Whether he's upset about his job or terrorism, all of these things are going to add to the psychology of the people, and certainly that they've hit Paris really hard. So a lot of negatives. Manufacturing never recovered. The U.S. dollar is hurting manufacturing. China is slowing. Europe is slowing. Unemployment rate in France unexpectedly shot up, and this was before the Paris attack. So I just don't see very many bright spots here.
Can the politicians come up with a solution, or should they just get the hell out of the way and let the markets decide what should be done?
Well, you know where I stand on that. No, they're not going to come up with a solution, but increasingly things are being radicalized, not just in the U.S., but also in Europe. The Financial Times had an article the other day on the triumph of Trumpism, and looked at all these extreme things that Donald Trump was saying. Well, it's not just Donald Trump saying extreme things. We've got in Spain, we've got a potential breakaway. Catalonia wants to break away from the rest of the Spain. That's pretty extreme. In the UK, the polls show for the first time in decades, the number of Britons favor leaving the EU totally. Cameron just postponed his target for December for working things out with Merkel. And so we've got increasingly radical talk from Le Pen, and of course people like Beppe Grillo, who I've not talked about for a long time, in Italy, are talking about having Italy break out of the Eurozone. So there's a lot of extreme talk in a lot of places, and it's extreme in both directions, because President Obama actually wants to admit more Syrians into the U.S., and he doesn't even want background checks on them because it would be too inconvenient. This is the kind of extreme polarization at both ends that politics in the United States and now spreading globally it has come to.
Well, and the whole thing maybe that started it was the so-called Arab Spring, but nothing good seems to have come out of that.
No, nothing good ever comes out of U.S. meddling. Look at what happened in Iraq. Look at what happened in Libya. Libya was actually on the verge of stabilizing before the UN came in and put in a no-fly zone. Now it's in the hands of terrorists. So it was absolutely crazy what we did. Everywhere we poke our nose, we make matters worse. And maybe it's time to sit back and just let someone else deal with it. We should actually be welcoming Russia, trying to take on ISIS. Instead, it's a counter-circular wave of madness with the U.S. trying to overthrow Assad, Russia trying to back him up. Meanwhile, both sides claim to be wanting to be fighting ISIS. Well, meanwhile, the U.S. of course is the largest weapons distributor, handing out weapons to former Al Qaeda rebels who want to overthrow Syrian President Assad, and it's crazy. We got rid of Saddam Hussein. There was a vacuum in its wake. That vacuum created ISIS, and now here we're trying to create another vacuum by taking out Assad. It makes no sense.
It seems to me those dictators, as horrible as they were to their own people, were doing everybody else in the world a favor by keeping the radicals under control.
Hussein absolutely did keep the radicals under control. He was a secular leader, not a religious leader. There was religious freedom in Iraq. Christians had in Iraq had free religion. The Shiites and Sunnis, well, they didn't precisely see eye to eye, but they didn't go around blowing themselves up to the extent that they are now. And here we went in and radicalized Iraq to the point where ISIS is a direct result of U.S. intervention and creating a vacuum by taking away Hussein and disbanding the Iraqi army.
ISIS is selling oil to somebody to make money to buy arms. A, how come no one's taking out the oil? And B, who is supplying all the ammunition?
Well, the ammunition comes from every time ISIS captured a city, it actually got U.S. weapons. So lots of weapons, anti-tank missiles, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of it's straight from the U.S. There's a lot of smuggling. The U.S. has supplied weapons to these so-called moderate terrorists or moderate Al-Qaeda or just moderates now. And some of them have defected over to ISIS because ISIS protected them and the U.S. didn't. So there's weapons smuggling all over. A lot of it comes in from Turkey, which Turkey denies, and Turkey has been, or at least people in Turkey, smugglers in Turkey have been buying oil directly from ISIS. That's where they get their money. Meanwhile, the U.S. has a drone policy, killing anyone and everywhere. It thinks without worrying about any collateral damage. All of a sudden, it claims that it's worried about civilians being hurt if it took out some of the trucks of ISIS delivering the oil. Well, these people may be civilians, and they may not be ISIS, but my God, they're dealing with ISIS, and for some reason, we're worried about taking out civilians who are directly responsible for funneling money to ISIS. It absolutely, none of this makes any sense if you sit down and look at everything that's going on.
What about Russia's claim that Turkey's president, his family and friends are personally profiting from the ISIS oil?
I don't know about that. There's certainly the claim out there. There's the counterclaim. Turkish president said, well, Putin, if you can't prove it, please resign. Putin called on Erdogan to resign. So I don't know. I would suspect that there's some degree of truth in all of that, but Russia needs to supply the evidence. It's the one making the claim. So so let's see the evidence. Clearly, there are Turkish smugglers involved in the ISIS oil trade. Whether or not that goes back to the direct point to Turkish leaders, I don't know. I suspect it does. But it's up to Russia to provide the proof.
What kind of play does this dispute in Syria have, or what kind of role does it have in the world economy?
I don't know that. Well, it's certainly had an impact here on the number of refugees flowing into Europe, and I've seen some cost estimates on that range up to $1 trillion, but €1 trillion. That's up to. But that's over the course of a number of years, 25 or 30 or something. But certainly it's not doing Europe any good. It's made a bigger mess out of Greece. Greece cannot afford. Greece is back in recession, by the way, and it has to deal with this influx of your refugees. So there's certainly a cost associated with this, and obviously we've had the Paris attacks. So there's some pretty significant costs to this.
Mike, thanks a lot for chatting with us.
It's a pleasure to be on.
My guest has been Mike Mish Shedlock, editor of Mish's Global Economic Trend Analysis. You're listening to HowStreet.com Radio. Find us on Twitter at Talk Digital Net. Our YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Comments about the show can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard.
Comments made on HowStreet.com Radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com Radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.